I've always wanted to make a video like this, but to be perfectly honest with you, I've never really had the balls to venture into this general direction. Plus, I normally make videos as a hobby and nothing more, and I generally concentrate on a little tank game and some military history. But recently, my little YT channel has decided to go in the opposite direction, what with losing subscribers and views, so I thought, what the heck, I've got nothing to lose, so bring it on. Now before I start this list, you have to remember that the arts generally, especially movies, are rather subjective. There's no right or wrong view as such. What I think could be a fantastic movie may differ to what you think and vice versa, but it doesn't make either you or I wrong. With that caveat firmly made, I also need to point out some of the criteria that I use for my list. As an ex-military person myself, who's also interested in military history, what I generally look for in a movie, especially a war movie, is not the gung-ho attitude or how much gore there is. I also tend to avoid movies that are totally inaccurate or purely fiction, such as The Battle of the Bulge or The Guns of Navarone. I also avoid those movies that carry a message of supremacy at the expense of the other side, or subliminal propaganda, such as U-251. What for me makes a good war movie is not just the story, but how that story is told and how the message is put across. In other words, does the movie seek to show us, the viewer, the harsh reality of war, and does it make us feel like we can both relate to that subject matter and try to understand the suffering caused in such an extreme environment, whilst making the actual viewing pleasant, albeit within the context of the extreme subject matter. So now you know my criteria and what I look for, but before I start, I think this video may have to go into two parts, as getting my point across in just one video may be rather long. But first, let's have some honourable mentions. So kicking off my list at number 5 is Dino De Laurentiis' epic war movie Waterloo, a movie that is often overlooked by many. Yes, it's an old movie made in 1970, and whilst it's not 100% historically accurate, it does attempt to capture the build-up to the battle and the battle itself quite well. With Rod Steiger playing an extremely convincing Napoleon and Christopher Plummer playing an equally convincing Wellington, the film starts with Napoleon's abdication from power, followed by his initial exile on the island of Elba. We then pick up the film with Napoleon's return, much to the excitement of the French population, and reinstalling his generals. We then move to the British side, led by Wellington, whereby we are shown that the attitude to war is rather blasé, to say the least, with a lot of tough talk between the junior ranks, set against the backdrop of the Duchess of Richmond's ball, something that actually happened in real life. We then move away from the prelude and we go to the battle itself, starting with the preparations. Again, we are shown a very blasé, casual attitude by the British, at one point asking to take a shot at Napoleon, whereby Wellington scoffs, "Certainly not. Leaders of armies have better things to do than shoot at each other." We then flip over and are shown the same views from the French side, with Napoleon belittling Wellington's positioning, exclaiming, "He's no student of Caesar," and "Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake," much to the entertainment of his staff officers. We then move on to the actual battle itself, with the French opening fire and the British somewhat casually and very gentlemanly recording the actual time. Oh, how it was done in those days. Here we are then taken as a viewer into the very heart of the battle, especially at the attack of Hougoumont, where we see the French forces slowly but ever so surely gain the upper hand. During this, we experience the total folly of war, with the British soldiers shouting over the other screams and the shooting and the noise of the battlefield. Why? Why do we kill each other? Eventually, however, the Prussians turn up, and with Napoleon away from the battlefield, Marshal Ney sends in the Old Guard, the elite French troops. But they are broken by the British defence, sending a shockwave through the French generals, to which Napoleon seems unable to accept, exclaiming, "I lost the battle of Austerlitz at 5:30 and won the war by 6. With the arrival of the Prussians, the French are now effectively outnumbered and being flanked, so the French retreat, finally giving victory to the British and Allied forces. We are then left with the reminder of the outcome of the war, with Wellington riding over the battlefield and stating, "Next to a battle lost, the saddest thing is a battle won." A very poignant reminder that war by its very nature is extreme folly. The reason I've chosen Waterloo and why it makes my list is that whilst not being totally accurate, it does stick closely to the actual events of the battle, and not just the fighting, but the general attitude of both parties. We are not invited to favour one side over the other, with equal weight being given to both the French and the British sides, as we, the viewers, are being drawn in to find empathy with both. We feel for Ponsonby with his tale that his father was killed by the French by getting stuck in the mud with his horse, only for him to suffer the same fate a few moments later. And no doubt many of us would feel like the Irish soldier screaming, "Why, why?" during the heat of the battle. We see that life, and to an extent war, during this period is taken as a game, and that both commanders suffer from utter hubris and overconfidence, both believing that they have better tactics, with little to no regard that others are doing the fighting for them. But we are then reminded at the very end that the commanders do actually have human feelings, with Wellington's lament on the battlefield. Waterloo is a truly amazing movie that has stood the test of time. It is well paced, it has good character arcs and stunning visuals, especially considering the time it was made. Waterloo makes my list because it takes us on a journey into a long ago battle and attempts to show us the futility of all of it, while staying true to the actual events. It's fair to say that most war films act as some form of propaganda, generally focusing on heroic deeds committed by those from the victorious side. Well, this film throws that concept totally and utterly out of the window. Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron is my number 4, a 1977 war film that, interestingly, especially for a Western-made movie, tells the story from the German side, focusing on the main character, Steiner, played amazingly by James Coburn. The film is set in late 1943 on the real battlefront of the Kuban bridgehead, when the tide of war was starting to turn against the Germans, and the film follows Steiner and his platoon on the Russian front. Not only does the film focus on the military conflict, but it also focuses on a class conflict between Steiner, a highly decorated, battle-hardened and very skilled soldier, and his newly arrived commander, Stransky, played brilliantly by Maximilian Schall, who is an inexperienced aristocrat eager to prove himself in combat and earn the fabled Iron Cross, mainly at the expense of others under his command. We first meet Steiner carrying out a well-coordinated attack on a Russian mortar platoon, where his platoon captures a child soldier and takes them as prisoner. Meanwhile, Stransky is reporting to the commanding officer of the unit, Brandt, played brilliantly by James Mason, and his adjutant, Kiesel, played equally as brilliantly by David Warner, after requesting a transfer from France to the Russian front in order to get his combat experience and win the prized Iron Cross, to which Brandt scoffs and offers him one of his. Stransky is pompous and full of himself, believing in the propaganda of the Nazi Party, insofar as believing that the Russians are inferior and that with his aristocratic background and beliefs he can make a real difference. although Brandt points out that morale is low due to defeat followed by more defeat, and the German soldier is not fighting for the stinking party, but for his stinking life. Steiner and Stransky finally meet up, and immediately is clear that Steiner doesn't follow the strict discipline of the army, ignoring Stransky at first and even failing to salute him. Stransky takes exception and then orders Steiner to execute the child soldier we saw captured earlier. Basically, Steiner refuses, pushing it back onto Stransky, adding more tension to an already developing tense relationship. Steiner then gives his after-action report to Stransky in Stransky's bunker, whereby his attitude is one of a man who has basically had enough of the war and is literally going through the motions. Stransky informs Steiner that he's been promoted, and he actually takes exception when Steiner's attitude is less than enthusiastic, saying to Steiner, "You don't sound impressed," to which Steiner replies, "I'm not." In a lull in the fighting, Steiner has a discussion about von Clausewitz's theory of war being foreign policy by other means, and then decides to release the Russian prisoner, the child, saying, "Take off one uniform, another lies beneath." The child, however, is killed as the Russian forces attack and Steiner is wounded. Meanwhile, Stransky is overwhelmed by the force of the attack and demands reinforcements whilst hiding under a table. A counterattack is then organised by Meyer and the Russians are repelled, but Meyer is killed. Steiner is now recuperating in hospital from his injuries, where he struggles to get to grips with the peacefulness of the situation and he misses his frontline comrades. Finally, and despite clear romantic overtones from a friendly female nurse, Steiner sees a member of his platoon on his way back to the front and joins him. Back at the front, Steiner discovers that Stransky has claimed the credit for Meyer's actions and is about to get the Iron Cross. Steiner, not overly fussed about the Iron Cross award, isn't that impressed because Stransky is trying to take credit for Meyer's actions, but he's reluctant to succumb to the military machine, despite his commanding officer Brandt telling him that he has always protected him, to which Steiner retorts, "I've never asked you to," prompting Kiesel to ask, "Why are you so ungrateful?" Steiner's response sums everything up. "What have I got to be grateful for? I hate all officers and I hate this stinking uniform." Stransky then meets up with Steiner regarding the Iron Cross and implores him to help, saying that if I go home without the Iron Cross, I couldn't face my family. To which Steiner nonchalantly replies, "You don't deserve the Iron Cross." Brandt is then ordered to retreat and he informs Stransky, who fails to inform Steiner, hoping that he will be killed and thus allowing him to get his Iron Cross. Despite the Russian onslaught, Steiner and his men manage to escape, and the remainder of the movie is basically focusing on them making their way back to the German lines. Stransky is informed that Steiner is on his way back, and he sends his adjutant out to kill them, but this fails. Steiner, having lost almost all his men, now finds Stransky, but instead of killing him, he offers to help show him where the Iron Crosses grow. And the film ends with Stransky fumbling at his weapon and Steiner laughing madly. For me, Cross of Iron is a raw, no-holds-barred look at how war affects people and how, over time, attitudes change. When we first meet Stransky, fresh from France, his uniform is crisp and well maintained, along with his hair. Compared to the uniforms of Brandt, Kiesel and Steiner, their uniforms are well worn and reflect their attitude as worn out by the pressures of war, something that is shown on their faces. The movie itself has two main themes: the actual strain of the conflict, but also the strain between two very different types of people, the high-class aristocratic Stransky and the working-class Steiner, where in war their roles are actually reversed, so that Steiner actually has more influence over Stransky, something Stransky realizes and tries to address early on in the movie, when he tells Steiner, "All that you are or will become depends on men like me." To which Steiner replies, "Generally, I find a man is whom he wishes to be." Ironically, both men share a total dislike towards the Nazi Party and find some, albeit small, solace in that, showing us that despite the class gap and their differences, they feel the same way in a lot of respects. I don't think this film would have had the same impact if it was shown from an Allied viewpoint. Peckinpah, by focusing on the German side, shows us that the Germans are not monsters, that they too are caught up in a situation of the military meat grinder, and it's something totally out of their control. And it's not due to some ideology, and all they're attempting to do is to try and survive. Something the combat veterans in the movie, like Steiner and Brandt, see as almost impossible, and it reflects and shows on their face. Iron Cross is not a film that either glorifies war or the Nazis, but it conveys a message that is more about the futility of war and removing the propaganda that war movies generally convey. It doesn't show heroic deeds or the fighting for a particular cause, it just shows the harsh reality, and even then Peckinpah takes it further with the end quote, "Don't rejoice in his defeat, you men, for though the world stood up and stopped the bastard, the bitch that bore him is in heat again." Proving that despite everything experienced in such wars, there will always be other medmen and other wars to fight. So that brings me to the end of video number 1, my top 5 war movies, part 1. We've still got 3 more movies to go, and some notable mentions of war movies that really suck. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you agree with my selection, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts below in the comments. And I hope to see you all again for part 2 of my top 5 war movies. I will say goodbye for now and I hope to see you all again very soon.